There is a kind of power most people never discover. Not the power that comes from raising your voice. Not the power that comes from winning arguments. Not even the power that comes from status, wealth, or the admiration of others. It is something quieter than all of those, and far more unsettling to the people around you. It is the power that appears the moment you stop being endlessly available. The moment you withdraw, not in anger, not in punishment, not as a strategy, but simply because you finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. That your presence is not owed to anyone, that your attention is not a default resource others are entitled to draw from whenever they need it. That your energy is finite, precious, and entirely yours to direct. Most people never reach this understanding, not because they are incapable of it, but because they were conditioned from the very beginning to believe the opposite. Carl Jung spent decades studying the psychological forces that shape human behavior beneath the level of conscious awareness, and one of the patterns he returned to repeatedly was this. The person who is always available is not seen as generous. They are seen as predictable, and what is predictable becomes, in the unconscious calculus of human relationships, something closer to furniture than to a person. Present. Useful. Taken entirely for granted. This video is about what happens when you finally stop. When you withdraw the unlimited access you have been offering to your time, your attention, your emotional labor, your patience, your presence. What happens to the people around you? What happens to the dynamics you thought were fixed? And most importantly, what happens inside you? Because the external shift, as dramatic as it can be, is only the surface of something far more significant. To understand why availability becomes a trap, you have to go back to where the pattern began. No one becomes endlessly available by accident. It is learned behavior, deeply learned. Learned early and reinforced so consistently that by adulthood it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like personality. Think about what most people were taught, directly or indirectly, about what it means to be good. Be responsive, be helpful, be present for others. Do not make people wait. Do not say no when you could say yes. Do not disappoint the people who need you. These lessons arrived in different forms for different people. For some, they came from parents who only expressed approval when the child was accommodating. For others, from social environments where being liked depended on being useful. For many, from the simple and repeated experience that being available produced warmth and withdrawing produced coldness, and warmth felt safer than coldness, so availability became the default setting, running automatically beneath every social interaction. Jung called the social mask that results from this conditioning the persona. The persona is not deception exactly. It is the set of characteristics a person develops over time in response to the demands of their environment. The characteristics that earned acceptance, that prevented rejection, that made belonging feel secure. And for a person who learned early that availability was the price of love, the persona becomes organized around accessibility, around being reachable, around responding quickly, around absorbing others' needs without complaint, around saying yes when the honest answer is no. The cruel irony that Jung identified is this. The persona that was built to secure love ends up preventing it, because the person others relate to is not the actual self. It is the performance of a self designed to be acceptable, optimized for approval, hollowed out of everything inconvenient or demanding or genuinely individual. And you cannot be truly loved for a performance. You can only be used by it. Here's what chronic availability actually does to a relationship over time. In the beginning, your responsiveness feels like warmth, your willingness to show up, to listen, to help, to adjust your own needs around someone else's. It reads as care, and perhaps it genuinely is care, at least in part. But something shifts, not dramatically, gradually. The other person's nervous system begins to register your availability as a fixed feature of the environment. The way a person stops noticing the furniture in a room they have lived in for years. It was remarkable once. Now it simply exists. And what simply exists does not generate gratitude. It generates expectation. Suddenly, though suddenly is the wrong word, because it happened so slowly you barely noticed, your reply within 5 minutes is no longer experienced as attentiveness. It is the baseline. Your assistance is no longer received as generosity. It is assumed. Your presence is no longer felt as something chosen. It is taken as something owed. And when you inevitably fail to meet the baseline, when you reply late, when you say no, when you are unavailable for a single hour, it registers not as a normal human limitation, but as a withdrawal of something that was supposed to be guaranteed. Jung understood this mechanism through the lens of what he called psychic energy. Every human being carries a finite amount of inner energy, the capacity to engage, to feel, to respond, to give. When that energy is distributed without boundaries, poured outward continuously toward anyone who reaches for it, for any reason, at any time, it does not replenish itself automatically. It depletes, and a depleted person does not become less available. They become available while empty, showing up physically while absent psychologically, responding while feeling nothing, performing presence while experiencing a creeping numbness that they cannot quite explain. This is not laziness. This is not ingratitude. This is the predictable result of a system that was never designed to run without limits. Now let us talk about what actually happens when you begin to withdraw. Not the gradual, almost invisible withdrawal of someone who is quietly burning out. The conscious withdrawal. The deliberate choice to become less accessible. To not reply immediately. To let certain conversations go unanswered. To decline invitations without extensive explanation. To allow silence to exist where you previously would have rushed to fill it. The first thing most people notice is the discomfort of going against a deeply conditioned reflex. The urge to explain yourself is almost physical. The anxiety that someone is upset with you, that you have failed them, that your silence will be interpreted as coldness, or arrogance, or indifference. It arrives quickly, and it is loud. This discomfort is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence of how deeply the conditioning runs, because the discomfort is not yours originally. It belongs to the pattern, to the years of learned behavior that taught you withdrawal was dangerous, that silence was rejection, that being needed was the same as being valued. And the pattern does not release its grip quietly. It argues, it generates guilt. It produces elaborate scenarios in which your unavailability causes harm to people who needed you. But stay with the discomfort long enough, and something else begins to emerge. There's a quality of attention you had forgotten was possible. Because when you are not continuously distributing your energy outward, something remarkable happens to what remains. It deepens. The thoughts you had been too distracted to finish begin completing themselves. The feelings you had been too busy to notice begin surfacing. The sense of who you actually are, beneath the persona, beneath the performance, beneath the accumulated habit of being whatever others needed you to be, begins to become legible again. Jung believed this was not a side effect of withdrawal. It was the point of it. The second thing that happens when you withdraw is both more surprising and more revealing. The people around you react. And how they react tells you something about the nature of what existed between you that no amount of comfortable conversation ever could. Some people barely notice, not because they do not care, but because the connection between you was never primarily organized around your constant availability. It was organized around something more mutual, more genuinely reciprocal. These people reach out when it feels natural, not because they have noticed a disruption in their supply of your attention. They ask how you are because they are genuinely curious about you, the actual you, not the version of you that was always reachable. Hold on to these people. They are rarer than you think, but then there is another category of response, and this is where it becomes genuinely illuminating. Some people react to your withdrawal with a disturbance that is completely disproportionate to the actual change in your behavior. You replied a few hours later than usual, and the energy shifted dramatically. You declined one invitation, and there was a coldness that lasted for days. You offered a shorter, less effortful response than usual, and somehow this was experienced as a form of aggression. The reaction in each case is far larger than the action that caused it, and that disproportion is the information, because what it reveals is that the connection was not built on genuine interest in who you are. It was built on consistent access to what you provide. Jung described this through the lens of projection. When someone relates to you primarily through the role you play for them, the emotional support, the reliable listener, the always available presence, they are not truly relating to you. They are relating to the image of you that serves their psychological needs. And when you step outside that image, when you become less predictable, less available, less perfectly fitted to the role they assigned you, the image is disrupted. And the disruption feels, to them, like a threat. Not because you have harmed them, but because you have forced them to confront something they were using your availability to avoid. The dependency they did not want to acknowledge. The emptiness that your constant presence had been filling. The fact that what they called connection was in significant part consumption. Your withdrawal does not create this reality. It simply makes it visible. There is a specific type of person for whom your unavailability becomes genuinely destabilizing. Jung would have recognized them immediately. They are the people whose sense of control over their own emotional state depends on having reliable access to yours, not because they are consciously manipulative, though some are, but because they have never developed the internal resources to regulate their own psychological experience without external input. They need someone to unload onto when anxiety spikes, someone to seek validation from when insecurity surfaces, someone to pull toward them when they feel distant from themselves. And you, reliably present, reliably responsive, reliably absorbing, became that someone, not through any single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small moments in which your availability was offered and accepted and gradually assumed. When you withdraw, these people do not simply feel disappointed. They feel destabilized, and destabilization produces behavior. Sometimes it looks like sudden increased attention, reaching out more than usual, expressing how much they miss you, a warmth that returns with surprising intensity the moment they sense your distance. Do not mistake this for genuine change. It is the system attempting to restore its equilibrium, to bring the resource back online. Sometimes it looks like irritation, a coldness, a sharpness, an accusation that you have changed, that you are being selfish, that the version of you that was always available was the real you, and this version is a disappointment. This too is the system attempting to restore equilibrium, through pressure rather than warmth. And sometimes, though this is harder to see in the moment, it looks like absence. The person simply stops reaching out, and the silence that follows can feel like confirmation that you did something wrong, that your withdrawal caused this loss, and the loss is your fault. But consider another interpretation. The connection that disappears the moment you stop being endlessly available was not a connection to you. It was a connection to your availability. And something that dissolves that easily was not solid enough to grieve. Jung wrote something that most people hear as philosophy, but that functions when applied to daily life as one of the most practically useful insights in the history of psychology. He wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. Apply this to the experience of withdrawal. When your unavailability irritates someone, when your silence disturbs them, when your boundaries produce anger, when your refusal to explain yourself generates accusations, what does that irritation reveal about them? It reveals the precise location of their dependency, the exact point at which they had assigned you a function in their psychological life that you were never meant to serve. Their irritation is a map. It shows you where the expectation was, where the assumption lived, where the role had been assigned so completely that you're stepping outside. It feels to them like a violation rather than a normal human act of self-direction. And here's the part that requires genuine honesty. The same map applies to you. Because the places where you feel most guilty about withdrawing, the specific relationships where unavailability feels most wrong, most selfish, most dangerous. Those are the precise locations where your own psychological patterns are most deeply embedded, where your sense of worth is most tied to being needed, where your fear of abandonment is most active, where the persona is doing its most determined work to keep you available, because available feels safer than the alternative. Jung believed that genuine self-knowledge was not a comfortable process. It was not achieved through positive affirmation or the careful avoidance of difficult truths. It was achieved through the willingness to look directly at the patterns in others and in yourself without flinching, and the experience of withdrawing, when engaged with honestly rather than reactively, offers exactly this: a mirror held up simultaneously to the nature of your relationships and the nature of your own psychological architecture. Both reflections are important, and both can be uncomfortable to look at. But here is where most people stop. They observe the reactions of others. They begin to see the dependency, the expectation, the assumption of access, and they make a decision, consciously or not, to interpret all of this as evidence that people are fundamentally selfish, that relationships are fundamentally transactional, that the appropriate response to seeing clearly is to close off, to become not simply less available, but unreachable, not boundaried, but armored. And Jung would have recognized this move immediately, not as wisdom, as the shadow of wisdom, the shape that genuine insight takes when it hardens into defense rather than deepening into understanding. Because the goal was never to become cold, the goal was to become conscious, and those are not the same thing. To understand the difference, you need to understand what Jung meant by psychic energy at a deeper level than most people encounter it. Jung did not use the term loosely. He meant something precise by it. Every human being carries a finite reservoir of inner energy, the capacity to engage genuinely, to feel fully, to be truly present in an interaction, rather than simply physically occupying the same space as another person. When that energy is well managed, directed consciously, protected from unnecessary depletion, allowed to replenish through genuine solitude and genuine rest, it creates something almost tangible in a person's presence. You have encountered this quality in certain people without being able to name it. The person who does not speak often, but when they do, the room changes. The person whose attention, when it lands on you, feels different from the attention of someone who is always available to everyone. The person who seems unhurried, undemanding, unswayed by the social currents that move everyone else, and who, precisely because of this, commands a quality of respect that the endlessly available person never quite achieves. This is not charisma exactly. It is not performance. It is the natural result of energy that has been conserved, directed, and not endlessly distributed to whoever reaches for it. Jung believed that this quality of presence was not a personality trait some people were born with and others were not. It was the natural state of a psyche that had learned to manage its own resources consciously. And the person who is chronically over-available, who distributes their energy without discrimination, who responds to every pull on their attention, who says yes when they mean no and stays when they need to leave, is not simply tired. They have lost the concentrated quality that makes genuine presence possible. They are everywhere, so they are nowhere, available to everyone, so they are truly present for no one, including themselves. Now let us talk about silence specifically, because silence is the tool that most people understand least about what happens when you become less available. Most people think of silence as absence, as the space where something should be, but is not, as a gap, a failure, a void where communication ought to exist. But Jung understood silence differently. He understood it as a form of presence, not the presence of words, but the presence of something more essential, the weight of a person who is not performing, not managing impressions, not filling space with sound to avoid the discomfort of stillness. Genuine silence, in this sense, is not passive. It is extraordinarily active. It is the refusal to participate in dynamics that do not serve genuine connection, the refusal to explain yourself to someone who is asking not because they want to understand you, but because your explanation gives them something to argue with. The refusal to react to provocation designed to pull you back into a dynamic you have outgrown. The refusal to fill emotional space that someone else needs to learn to fill for themselves. This kind of silence disturbs people, not because it is cruel, because it is honest. And honesty, in social environments built on mutual performance, is deeply disruptive. Think about what happens when you do not respond to a message designed to provoke a reaction. The person who sent it expected something: anger, defense, explanation, the confirmation that they still have access to your emotional responses. Your silence denies them all of it, and in that denial, something shifts. Not because silence is a strategy, though it can appear that way from the outside, but because silence is the natural response of a person who has decided that not every pull on their attention deserves to be honored, that not every conversation deserves their genuine engagement, that their inner world is not a public resource available for extraction by whoever knows which buttons to press. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming genuinely yourself, requires this capacity. The capacity to remain inside your own center while the world pulls at you from the outside, to feel the pull without being moved by it automatically, to choose your responses rather than simply having them triggered. And silence is often the first evidence that this capacity is developing. There is something specific that happens to manipulative dynamics when you withdraw your availability, and it is worth examining carefully because it is frequently misunderstood. When a person has been relating to you primarily through the role you played, through the emotional function you served, through the reliable access they had to your reactions, your withdrawal does not just disappoint them, it destabilizes the entire dynamic, because the dynamic was not built on two people meeting each other honestly. It was built on one person's consistent availability being used as a psychological resource by another. And when the resource is withdrawn, the dynamic has nothing left to run on. This reveals itself in specific ways. The person who always came to you in crisis suddenly has no one to call, and rather than developing their own capacity to manage difficulty, they escalate. The crisis becomes louder. The need becomes more urgent. The emotional pressure increases. This is not necessarily conscious manipulation. It is the system attempting to restore what it lost. But it is also, if you can observe it without being pulled back in, extraordinarily clarifying, because it shows you exactly how the dynamic worked, how your availability was functioning not to support someone's genuine growth, but to substitute for it, how your presence was preventing them from developing the inner resources they would need if you were not there, and how your withdrawal, painful as it is in the moment, is in some sense the most honest thing you could offer. Not because withholding is generous, but because endless availability to someone who needs to develop their own resources is not generosity. It is, in a very specific psychological sense, a form of harm. Jung understood this through the concept of individuation. Every person has the capacity and the responsibility to develop their own psychological wholeness, to integrate their shadow, to examine their patterns, to build an inner life that does not depend entirely on external input for its stability. When you are endlessly available, you make it possible for someone to avoid this work indefinitely. Your presence absorbs the discomfort that would otherwise force them toward genuine development. Your availability fills the space that their own self-knowledge should occupy. And in doing so, you do not help them, you hold them in place. Let us be honest about something that rarely gets said directly in conversations about boundaries and availability. The process of becoming less available is not simply uncomfortable for the people around you. It is uncomfortable for you, genuinely, deeply uncomfortable, in ways that are easy to dismiss as guilt, but that are actually more complex than that. Because for many people, the decision to become less available does not just feel like setting a limit. It feels like a form of loss. The loss of a role that, however exhausting, provided something real. Being needed is not nothing. The sense that your presence matters, that your absence would be noticed, that people depend on you. These things are not simply burdens. They are also, in a complicated way, a source of meaning. And when you withdraw availability, you withdraw yourself from that source, at least temporarily, at least until something else has grown strong enough to replace it. Jung called this the necessary suffering of individuation, not suffering as punishment, suffering as the unavoidable cost of genuine transformation. Because you cannot move from a life organized around others' needs to a life organized around your own center without passing through a period where the old meaning has dissolved and the new meaning has not yet fully formed. That period is uncomfortable. It can feel like loss, like loneliness, like the strange emptiness of a life that no longer has the familiar shape it used to have. And the temptation in that period is to return, to restore the old availability, to fill the emptiness with the familiar weight of being needed. Because emptiness is uncomfortable, and familiarity, even when it was exhausting, at least had a known shape. But Jung was clear about what returning means. It means choosing the persona over the self, choosing the comfort of a known pattern over the discomfort of genuine growth. And it means, ultimately, remaining exactly where you were, performing the same role, in the same dynamics, with the same depletion, indefinitely. The discomfort of withdrawal is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something real. What grows in the space that chronic availability used to occupy is worth describing carefully, because it is not what most people expect. Most people expect that becoming less available will produce a cleaner, simpler, less complicated life, fewer demands, more peace, a sense of lightness where the weight used to be. And some of this does come. But what comes alongside it, what grows in the genuine silence, in the honest solitude, in the space that was previously filled with constant social management, is something more complex and more valuable than simple relief. It is self-knowledge, not the kind of self-knowledge that comes from reading about yourself, from taking assessments, from being told by others who you are. The kind that only emerges when you are quiet enough to hear your own mind, without the interference of constant social noise. You begin to notice what you actually think, as distinct from what you have been performing thinking. What you actually feel, as distinct from what you have been managing feeling. What actually matters to you, as distinct from what you have learned to express mattering because it was expected or rewarded. And this self-knowledge changes the way you move through the world, in ways that are subtle but pervasive. You become harder to manipulate, not because you become suspicious or defensive, but because you have developed enough clarity about your own inner state that external attempts to distort it are easier to recognize. You know what you feel. So when someone tells you that what you feel is wrong, the claim lands differently than it once did. You become slower to make commitments you do not intend to keep, because you have learned to notice the difference between a genuine yes and a performative yes. The one given to avoid discomfort rather than because you actually want to. You become more honest in the connections you do maintain, because the energy you previously distributed across dozens of surface-level interactions is now concentrated in fewer, deeper ones. And the quality of those connections, the ones that survived your withdrawal, the ones that did not depend on your endless availability for their existence, is qualitatively different from what you had before. Jung believed that the goal of psychological development was not happiness exactly, not comfort, not the elimination of difficulty, not the achievement of a life without conflict or loss. The goal was wholeness, the integration of all the parts of the self, including the parts that had been suppressed, denied, pushed into the shadow because they did not fit the persona. And becoming less available is, in a very direct sense, an act of integration. Because the part of you that is tired, genuinely, deeply tired of being available, is real. The part of you that wants to say no is real. The part of you that needs solitude, needs silence, needs to stop being the person everyone reaches for before they have learned to reach for themselves. That part is real. And it has been suppressed for years, perhaps, in service of the persona, in service of the version of yourself that was acceptable, manageable, reliably present for everyone who needed you. When you allow that suppressed part to surface, when you honor the need for withdrawal, for silence, for genuine rest, from the labor of constant availability. You are not abandoning who you are. You are returning to who you are, beneath the performance, beneath the conditioning, beneath the decades of learned behavior that taught you your worth was measured in your usefulness to others. Here is what becomes possible on the other side of this. Not immediately, not without cost, not without the discomfort and the loss and the necessary suffering that Jung described. But eventually, you begin to choose your presence rather than defaulting to it. And chosen presence carries a completely different quality than obligated presence. When you are somewhere because you genuinely want to be there, not because you felt you had to be, not because saying no would have been too uncomfortable, not because your worth required it, the quality of your engagement changes entirely. The people you are with feel the difference, even if they cannot name it, because they are finally meeting you, the actual you, not the performance of you. And genuine meeting, even when it is rarer, is worth more than constant access to a persona. You begin to understand, at a level that is no longer theoretical, the difference between being valued and being used, between connection that is genuinely mutual and connection that exists because you make it easy, between relationships that nourish you and relationships that require you to deplete yourself to survive. And you begin, slowly and imperfectly, to organize your life around the former rather than the latter. Not perfectly, not without regression, not without moments of returning to old patterns, because the old patterns are familiar, and familiarity has its own gravity, but with increasing clarity about what is real and what is performance, what serves genuine human connection, and what serves only the maintenance of dynamics that were never truly serving you. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, not who you were shaped to perform, not who others needed you to be for their own psychological comfort, not the version of yourself that was optimized for acceptance, that learned to say yes when it meant no, that distributed its presence without limit and called the exhaustion loyalty. Who you truly are, and that becoming, that slow, costly, genuinely difficult process of individuation begins at a very specific moment. Not when you read the right book, not when you have the right insight, not even when you fully understand the psychology of what has been happening. It begins the moment you act, the moment you do not reply immediately, and let the discomfort of that sit without rushing to resolve it. The moment you decline without a 3-paragraph explanation and allow the discomfort of being possibly misunderstood. The moment you withdraw from a dynamic that has been consuming you and remain withdrawn long enough for something true to surface in the space that withdrawal creates. These are not dramatic moments. They do not feel like transformation when they are happening. They feel like small, uncomfortable choices against a very strong current. But they accumulate, and what they accumulate into over time is a life that is genuinely yours. Not the life that was built from the outside in, assembled from others' needs, others' expectations, others' comfort, but built from the inside out, from the actual center of who you are, directed by genuine values rather than fear, organized around what truly matters rather than what is merely demanded. That life is quieter than the one you had. It has fewer people in it, sometimes. It is less immediately legible to those who only knew the available version of you. But it is real, and it is sustainable, and it is, in the most honest sense of the word, yours. If something in this reached you, not just intellectually, but somewhere more specific, somewhere you recognized, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been giving too much of, because naming it is the beginning of protecting it.